Back to the Friday video edition of the Daily Caller podcast, part 2, Electric Boogaloo. We have a second special guest. Joining us now is somebody whose name I know I'm going to butcher, and her title I'm not even going to attempt when she was at the EPA. It's Mandy, I screwed up your first name. I was worried about
that.
Mandy Gunasekara?
That's good. That's great.
Good enough or good? Is it right?
It's Gunasekara.
Okay, Gunasekara. I was close-ish. Now, for the puzzling part, tell us what your title was. You just recently left the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. What was your title?
Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Air and Radiation.
I wrote fewer words in my book. That is a hell of a title. But now you've left and you've started Energy 45, which tell us about Energy 45.
It's a pro-Trump nonprofit, and it's all about supporting the president's re-election campaign and reshaping the narrative around energy and environment issues, mostly telling the good news story we already have to tell, and leadership actions the president has taken with respect to each of those areas, and talking about it on anyone who will listen.
Well, we're listening. And this is going to be one of the battlefields that Democrats choose. When I was a health policy analyst at the Heritage Foundation, most Republicans, and when I was briefing members of Congress on the Medicare Modernization Act, for example, they were terrified of the issue. They seeded it it's a Democratic issue, but I have to be able to talk for 3 minutes about it. So give me some data, give me some talking points, help me out, get through that. Because they stayed away from it like it was the plague, because it was the Democrats' playground. It was like one gang crossing into another gang's territory. There were like 3 members in the House and 2 in the Senate who actually took the issue seriously, and everybody else kind of stayed back. Environmentally, it seems like that's the same way. This is thought of as a Democrats' issue, and the Republicans are kind of afraid of it. Have you found that to be the case? They're interested, but they're afraid of it because they feel like as soon as you venture into the other team's turf, you're at a natural disadvantage.
Well, they're afraid of it, and rightfully so, because the other side, they don't have great policy arguments. So what they've done is any Republicans who delve into this space and come up with a legitimate, well-thought-out, science-based response, they go after and they attack them personally. Mm-hmm. You've seen this. I used to work for Senator Jim Inhofe. He was one of the courageous Republicans.
I love Senator Inhofe.
He's great.
Snowball thrower on the floor of the Senate is always going to have a warm place in my heart.
You know, I took the snowball to the floor.
Did you?
Yeah. Oh. I'm the girl in those memes, so add that to my resume as well.
There you go.
But he was one of the few Republicans that for years has been talking about these issues and bringing up something Democrats never like to talk about, which is the cost of what they're proposing and how that would actually impact his constituents back home in Oklahoma, is how he used to couch everything. But nonetheless, Republicans historically have not been as willing to engage in this issue because the other side has done a really good job of casting personal attacks and making people's life very difficult when they go out and want to talk about this from a policy perspective.
As somebody who worked for a while at the EPA, has that Republican silence allowed the left to get away with a lot more than they otherwise would? Because, well, you don't want to debate policy. I assume you're also reluctant to call out what the bureaucratic state is doing as well. You just want to stay away from the issue, and that under the Obama administration, I imagine that gave them a pretty free hand.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why there's a void out there in terms of Republicans who will go out and talk about these issues. That's one of the reasons I started Energy 45. Been dealing with this for a long time as a Senate staffer, and then at EPA. It was really hard when we were actually doing very good pro-environmental work. When we would roll it out, it would immediately get attacked by the New York Times and a whole cast of NGOs out there saying that we were doing the opposite of what we were actually doing, which was taking a tangible and practical approach to fulfilling the important mission of protecting public health and the environment.
When you rolled back, the Trump administration rolled back a lot of regulations, thankfully, and there's plenty more. God knows there's enough regulations out there. But when you're doing this and you see the media coverage basically accusing you of taking buckets full of mercury and dumping it into the drinking water, you want children to get asthma. You want people to have unsafe drinking water. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez just this week went on a rant over the concept of the Green New Deal being elitist, which we can get into. But she's saying, are the people in Flint who are dying of lead poisoning elitists? Are the children in the Bronx who are getting asthma at a higher rate than anybody else in the country elitist? First of all, what's your response to what she said? And secondly, when you're in the bureaucracy itself, Is there that mentality there's a permanent bureaucracy and then there's the temporary political appointment bureaucracy. What's the relationship like between the permanent and temporary when it seems like the permanent's natural inclination is left? They have to justify their jobs, and many of them are true believers. When an administration comes in that wants to curtail that power and roll back some of that power.
So I'll start with the first question, responding to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's rant yesterday. And I would say, like many of her rants, she didn't really know what she was talking about. First, when it comes to air quality, we have reduced criteria pollutants, which are potential causes of asthma that she was referring to. We've reduced those 73% since 1970. We're in really good shape, and that's going to continue under the direction of this administration. And on water, let's just remind everybody that the Flint crisis occurred under the Democrat-led administration under President Barack Obama. And what we've done when we came in, when Scott Pruitt first took over, he couched our mission as going back to basics, which was getting away from being the agency of climate change and focusing on the core missions of the agency. So clean air, clean water, clean land. And we've achieved immense success in each of those categories.
But I will point out that the air quality in the Bronx and the water in Flint, while horrible in any situation, have nothing to do with climate.
No, you're exactly right.
So it's completely irrelevant to what she was arguing.
Yes, exactly. She's trying to conflate air quality and water quality issues with her climate change discussion, and the two are totally separate. And she also was very misinformed with the status of where we are on air quality and where we are on water infrastructure. And on Flint, just so everyone knows, this administration is investing billions of dollars in plussing up infrastructure all over the country and actively addressing the crisis in Flint. So problems created by the last administration that had tangible impacts on the health of local citizens, the Trump administration has come in and taken a meaningful approach to actually fix.
On the temporary versus permanent bureaucratic state, how hard was it? I assume ultimately they have to do what they're ordered to do. That's their job ultimately. But is there a pushback? Is there a resistance? Is there actual friction between the political appointees and the will of the people, quite frankly, because, the president was duly elected, and the permanent bureaucratic state?
Yes, there is a resistance. Now, not all of the civil servants that work in the agencies are a part of that. I worked with some really great professionals when I was at EPA and the Office of Air, and then other offices that I worked in, the Water Office, the Land Office, and the Administrator's Office. So there are some true civil servants that understand their role, and they understand the dynamic when new political leadership comes in. Their day-to-day lives and what their priority actions are going to change, and they respect that.
And their personal opinions are irrelevant, I think, is another thing that you kind of have to, that would be, I think, the harder thing to counteract.
Yes, and I couldn't have that type of job, but there's people who sign up for it, and they do it very well.
Well, I get 20 years and a pension, so that's why you do it.
There's a lot of other benefits to it as well, yeah. But there are others that would actively work against us, and there's all sorts of ways you can do it in the bureaucratic process. You can slow things down. You can take 3-week-long vacations and then come back and forget about the multiple meetings we had about the next steps in pushing something through. You can leak things out to the press, which got out a lot. It seemed like every time we were about to roll out.
And spun, I imagine, not just leaked accurately.
Yeah, exactly. Every time we were getting ready to roll some big initiative out, somehow the New York Times got a hold of it, and it was very reflective of the spin from somebody within the agency that was not appreciative or on board with the direction we were ultimately going.
Is there an are they actively looking for those moles? Not moles, but those leakers in the. I get that in the executive, in the White House, they are, but even down at the EPA level, are they? Is there an investigation into finding out who these people are, and is there a penalty if they're found?
No, it would.
Can you fire a civil servant if they're found talking to Maggie Haberman, for example?
No, you can't. So it'd be somewhat of a waste of time. We just try to make decisions, establish priority initiatives, and get them through. And when there's a kink along the way, we address that kink. And so the focus and energy is on getting that done versus finding the people who are working against us. Now, you kind of know. You kind of have an idea. I had my suspicions about people.
So they suddenly get left off of email chains and are not invited to meetings. Is that kind of how it is? So we're paying a whole bunch of bureaucrats that nobody in the administration trusts to not show up to meetings. And, oh, God.
Well,
must be nice to
it's
be a
interesting.
government employee.
It certainly is for some. We took a very open door policy in terms of inviting people in and encouraging those who disagreed with us on the direction or disagreed with our view of whether it was the science or the engineering analysis or whatever, to come in and speak their piece of mind. And that was important to us. And there are a lot of people who appreciated that everyone come in and say your piece type mentality. Now, nobody knows that on the outside. We have a reputation that would suggest otherwise,
Right.
but we always gave people the opportunity to come in and let us know what they
Scott
think.
Pruitt with a whip dictating what everybody must do no matter how bad it is, and bringing that proverbial barrel of mercury down to the drinking water because he wanted to kill as many people as humanly possible. At least that's what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tells me. Speaking of her and the Green New Deal, this week there was a vote in the Senate. This is so important. We're all going to die in 12 years, by the way, so I'm not really sure why they're worried about free college and jobs for everybody. We should be living it up.
Very good point.
But the Green New Deal in the Senate it got a donut. 0 votes in the Senate. Nobody would do it. Now, the argument they all put forth was rather funny. Well, I'm not going to play by Mitch McConnell's rules. Simultaneously, out of the other side of their mouth, they're telling us this is so important we must address it immediately. We cannot wait. Yet then they're saying we have to have hearings. We have to slow walk this. We have to do some studies. Talk a little bit about the Green New Deal, first from an environmental perspective, because most people think Green New Deal, it's all about the environment. Very little of it is actually about the environment. Most of it is about a social justice warrior's fever dream of imposing complete government control over our lives. But from an environmental perspective, what they're pushing, retrofitting all the buildings, solar and wind, nothing else. From an environmental standpoint, in your area of expertise, what would that do? Would that save us, so quote unquote?
No, it wouldn't.
But she said.
I know she says it very fervently.
Yeah.
So you'd like to believe her, but unfortunately, none of what she said in the respect of the Green New Deal and the policies she put out are rooted in reality, and none of them will have significant impacts on reducing greenhouse gases. So what we should all know is that we already lead the world in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions without the Green New Deal, without a carbon tax, without a cap and trade or a dividend or whatever the other ideas are out there to potentially try and change the landscape. We are leading the world in reducing greenhouse gas emissions because of innovative technologies in our energy extraction industry, like hydraulic fracturing.
Which they hate.
I'm sure.
And
yeah.
nuclear.
And nuclear.
Absolute 100% clean, and they hate it.
Yeah, it's the only.
It's almost like they have a different agenda from the one they tell us.
I think that was on full display the other day when not a single one of them voted for and in support of their own resolution that they put forward. And to your point about not playing by Mitch McConnell's rules, he's the leader of the Senate.
Right.
All he does is bring bills to the floor for people to vote on.
And he didn't change any of the wording in this resolution. It's a non-binding resolution. Well, then it's a harmless thing to vote for.
Yes.
And I'm not going to vote by Mitch McConnell's rules. Well, then you're not going to vote for anything, because that's all that's going to come up in the Senate. But from what percentage of the Green New Deal, as we know about the guaranteed income for people unwilling to work,
right,
which they quickly retracted the notes that they accidentally released on that and said, no, that's not a part of it. But what percentage would you say actually addresses environmental issues, however wrongly, relative to the rest of the social engineering that they've crammed in there under the name of social justice?
So I saw one statistic out there. I didn't double check it, but somebody said, of the Green New Deal, around 14 to 16% of it was actually affiliated with environmental issues. Now, 100% renewable, there's problems with that because of intermittency, meaning that
if the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always
exactly
shine. And night happens with the sun, so if you're dependent on that.
So there's some problems there, or things like clouds can
Right.
get in the way of you being able to watch TV or use your cell phone or whatever it may be that you enjoy 100% of the time right now. But to make it work, consistent with the expectations that we all have, which is when we flip the lights switch, the lights actually come on, it has to be backed up by other sources of energy, which is natural gas primarily, or coal in some instances. But when you have backup power to wind and solar, it's not used as efficiently. So when you have to turn it on and off all the time, that creates more emissions than would other be created if you just relied on the energy sources that actually worked in the most efficient way.
We all want a clean environment. There isn't anybody who really does just want to pepper the water supply with mercury or lead or anything like that. But what I've found in my time in Washington, D.C., scares the hell out of me whenever a Democrat comes up with one of these massive solutions. We saw this with Obamacare. There was nothing going on healthcare. Everybody was talking about it, but no real massive legislative push. Then suddenly the Democrats slapped this 2,000-page monstrosity on the table. And then Republicans come out, here's our version. Here's a better way to do this, we think. And they've then ceded the issue. The government should stop people from polluting, actual polluting. CO2 I don't consider to be a pollutant. It's what we're exhaling as we talk. But there's always a risk when a Democrat proposes something big that a Republican will propose something slightly less big and say, well, this is the better way. And once they've done that, they've ceded the concept that the government must act. Are we risking that? Are Republicans a gathering behind something else that we should, while not the Green New Deal, could be not quite as bad, but still just as close to it?
Yeah, there's some Republicans out there that are trying to figure out what's going to be the response to the Green New Deal. And I think to your point that
it can't just be, no, this is awful.
Which it should
you have
be,
to have,
right? This is
unnecessary. The science is garbage. This is politics. That should be their response.
Yeah, and hopefully the people who are considering coming up with a response, they'll have a chance to watch Senator Mike Lee's presentation yesterday, which he laid out a very
anything that involves
case.
Reagan riding a velociraptor with a rocket launcher is A-okay with me.
Same here. I like the Aquaman meme the best, actually.
Giant seahorse.
That's really going to work out well. But yeah, there are Republicans out there trying to figure out what's our response going to be. And so part of my message to them has been, you don't need a response. What we've been doing up until this point in time is why we, again, lead the world in greenhouse gas emission reductions without the Paris Climate Accord.
Yeah, without the, it was the Japan thing.
Without the Kyoto Protocol.
Without Kyoto. Talk about that, because that doesn't get enough play. We're always portrayed as one of the biggest polluters on the planet. Again, CO2 isn't a pollutant, but we are actually rolling back. We aren't the problem. If you eliminated all the CO2 in the United States, for how long would that reduce the total CO2 production on the planet? 'Cause I imagine with China and India, whatever we got rid of, they would more than surpass pretty quickly.
Again, I'm quoting a statistic I didn't double check, but I read somewhere that if we were to shut down all greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S., it would be a matter of weeks that all of that would be replaced by emissions in China and India. So it would be all for naught. The biggest offenders in terms of that are in India and China and Indonesia and some of these other places that have signed on to things like the Paris Climate Accord. And people on the left herald them as, well, they're the new leaders on climate, which is as ridiculous as the Green New Deal is going to save us all from ourselves.
I made this argument. I could have been making it up, but I made it anyway because it's my show, that you hear all these statistics, the natural disasters, they're becoming bigger. There's more damage. They always throw around dollar amounts. Right. $400 billion worth of damage from this hurricane and that one and this. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, if you know, that has more to do with population density now along the coasts, which wasn't necessarily there in the 50s. You could probably buy a strip of land along the Atlantic Ocean down in one of the Carolinas pretty cheaply in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah.
Now you can't, and nobody's going to plop a trailer on it. It's a very expensive big house. And
yes.
So that has a lot to do with it, more so because I believe that if you choose the unit of measure, you'll always come out ahead. If they talk about dollar amounts for natural disasters, which is an irrelevant statistic ultimately, because it does have to do with things costing more and more people having built things in places that, like Hurricane Alley, which is probably not a good thing to do. They call it that for a reason, and they didn't just start calling that in the 80s. About the statistics that we hear thrown around so often to justify and necessitate action on behalf of the government, what would you say is the biggest garbage statistic, if you know what I mean?
Well, I think referencing extreme weather events to begin with. If you read even the International Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which is the body at the United Nations that studies climate change from scientists all around the world, if you read the report, not the policy for summary makers, which is largely written by activist scientists, kind of like we have a lot of activist journalists these days along those same lines, but if you read the actual report, it lays out very clearly that there's been no instances of increase in extreme weather events in certain areas, whether we're talking about about North America or in Europe or in the relative Arctic areas. And the other big problem, too, is that the nexus between increased CO2 emissions and extreme weather events, that is still very much an unsettled scientific issue. And so people, mainly Democrats, try to cite those type of events because they are horrible events. And it instills the type of fear in people when they're talking about climate change that substantiates the policies they're putting forward, which would require you and I to hand over our personal liberties and decisions that we would like to make about where we live and how we get there over to a Democrat Party.
You said something that's hugely important, because when I was doing health policy, the Kaiser Family Foundation would put out these phone books worth, if anybody even knows what a phone book is anymore, these phone books worth of, it's basically your phone printed, your contact list printed.
Totally.
A phone book's worth of study, and then they would put out a 2 or 3 page summary of what they wanted to highlight out of there. It was always something that our current system is horrible. We need to go to a single payer healthcare system. But at Heritage, we didn't have the budget that Kaiser did. So we'd go through, and you'd find the real data in there. You'd find really interesting data that they didn't hide, but they didn't highlight either, because
Right.
all the reporters it's easier to read 3 pages and get what they want you to do. That sort of thing happens with the IPCC. Explain that a little bit further, because there's this number. Well, 97% of scientists agree. They're all on board. And this unanimous UN report says X, Y, or Z, and therefore we're all going to die if we don't cede our liberty to the government. When in reality, the journalists who are reporting on it never sit down and read those studies. Talk about the disconnect between the summary and the political writing of the summary versus the actual science, because we're told all the time we're denying science.
Yeah, so what drives the political journalists mostly is attractive headliners. And so they come up with these massive statistics, the 97%, or it's the world's hottest year, the 14th year in a row. So that they prioritize trying to attract people and interest to either their article or website or whatnot.
It's a meaningless statistic, the warmest year on the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, again, you look at long-term trends, not year-to-year variabilities. It's something to take account of, but it's not indicative of the long-term trend, which is what we should be looking at when you're talking about climate change. On the science, though, it's much more nuanced and much more complex than a single statistic talking about relative consensus. There is consensus that the climate is changing, but the more important question is what role are humans actually having? And the more important question about that is what can we actually do about it? And Mitch McConnell referenced this the other day when he was asked, do you believe in climate change? And he was like, yes. And do humans have an impact? And he said, yes, but the more important question is what should we be doing and what can we do to actually address it? And that's still very unsettled from a scientific perspective.
But we only have 12 years or we're all dead. I fear that there are cultists out there. The problem with the planet is humans. And we have 7 billion people, 7.5 billion people on the planet. That's far too many. We saw this argument in the 70s when they were worried about population overgrowth. And we're never going to be able to feed more than 5 billion people. And we had famine then. We have 2 billion more people, and they're not the large famines in Africa that we had then. But it is incredibly dangerous. Is this a cult more so than anything based in reality? I imagine with every cult leader, there's a smidgen of truth. They base it on something, and then they take it to places where it was never intended. How much would you say is there truth in what the left is pushing when it comes to the doomsday, we're all going to die?
I think some of them are drawn to the noble cause of wanting to.
You can save the planet.
Yeah, who wouldn't want to be a part of that?
Right.
That sounds great. Sign me up for that.
More importantly, who'd want to be against that?
Well,
what kind of monster would want to be against that?
Yeah, I don't know.
That's
They try to paint Republicans as the party against saving the planet and killing all of
as if
humankind.
that's a good business model.
Well, exactly.
We'll win all the elections when everybody's dead. Let's go that route.
Yeah, and we'll have the best businesses in the world too, and no one can actually work there. It's a brilliant argument. But no, what I've seen, and I went to when I was in the Senate and at EPA, I went to the climate conferences, the United Nations conferences that were brought under the umbrella of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Treaty. So there's a lot of acronyms you have to familiarize yourself with. But nonetheless,
they're not worried about the carbon footprint of the titles of their events.
Yeah, that's a lot of ink and a lot of paper just to fit all that in. But nonetheless, people there, it has become somewhat of a religion or somewhat cultish, and they start out almost with a canon when they open up their discussion is, I believe in climate change. I believe that it's real. I believe that humans are the driving force, and it's an existential threat we must all address immediately.
All glory be to Pope Goris IV.
Exactly.
May he walk with you.
Amen. Go forth and namaste. So there is certainly an element of that, and there are some folks there who truly do want to take tangible efforts to improve the environment, but it all gets lost in the bigger rhetoric that is more politically driven and about attracting attention.
Is it really a problem with a government that's so big and departments that are so big that a good idea can't just stand on its own? Everybody sees, oh, this is a good idea. It's got a good chance of going through. And as it goes through, everybody just gloms everything else onto it. Most pieces of legislation should be 3 sentences.
100%.
1 page.
Yes.
But they can't be because everybody says, well, this 3 sentences is going to pass easily, so let's throw in a new bridge for my town. And they just lard it up with everything else. Is it the same way in the environmental field?
It's a little bit different the way that you draft regulations, but regulations today aren't like regulations of the past. In the same instance where, they used to be 20-ish pages, and now they're hundreds, if not thousands of pages. And so it's massive amounts of technical documents and legalese, and it's like that because EPA and DOE and all the agencies end up getting sued on these regulatory actions, and when the courts delve into it, they look at the record before them. And so EPA and all the agencies have taken seriously what it means to build out the record before them, ultimately to win in terms of progressing whatever the relative regulation is.
Last question, Mandy. What do people need to know, not just about anything in the environmental world, anything in the EPA going forward, whether it's about the Green New Deal or something good that the administration is? What is the unreported, underreported thing that you think people should know?
That the best thing we can do for the environment is to support President Trump's energy dominance agenda, because when we extract and use more American-made energy and American-developed energy, that's the best thing you can do for the planet.
Mandy, unpronounceable last name. Gunasekara?
Yeah, that's good.
That's good or right?
It's good.
Yeah. Where can they find? What's the website? You have a website?
Yeah, I do. It's www.energy45.org.
All right. The numbers, don't spell them out. Energy45.org. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sorry for your last name.
It's all right.
Mispronouncing it. I'm sure your husband's lovely, but he should have shortened it. Anyway, thank you for watching. Thanks for listening. Click subscribe and all that good stuff. Stick around. We still have to do the drawing. That's right. Be right back.